All right, so we've talked about all sorts of different medicines. But if I want to go get a prescription filled, where do you go to get a prescription filled? Oh, yeah, you go to the drugstore. But wait a second, weren't you told as a kid just say no to drugs because drugs are bad? But I just said I had to go to the drugstore to get my husband's prescription, which is a type of medicine. But how is medicine and drugs? Are they the same or are they different? Hmm, that is this section. So drugs and medicines are both just chemicals. They're indistinguishable from one another as chemicals, but they have different connotations. Like I said, you've been told since you were a little kid, just say no to drugs. Drugs are bad. But you go to the drugstore to get your medicine. Now, whether or not a certain chemical, certain compound is considered to be licit or illicit depends on the outlook of a particular society at that particular time. And we'll talk about some different examples of this. And actually, right now, this is often on the news even as we speak. So let's look at some different ideas of drugs versus medicines. And I know for most of us, drug has a negative connotation and medicine has a positive connotation. But again, we're going to use those two terms fairly interchangeably throughout this particular chapter. So the first one that we want to look at, and again, this goes back to the idea of licit and illicit. It depends on the outlook of society. We're going to start by looking at alcohol. Now, back in 1920, there was actually an amendment to the Constitution that alcohol was outlawed. You couldn't have alcohol. That was repealed back in 1933. So, in this 13-year span, you have lots of racketeering, you have lots of crime, and you'll talk about the mobs coming forth and the start of NASCAR and bootlegging and all sorts of these stories coming out about whether or not it was legal to use alcohol. Now, alcohol is ethanol. Let me see if I can find my little pen. Ethanol, let's see how good you remember. How many carbon is eth? That means that we have two carbons. And the "all" at the end means that we have an OH group. Now this should have some more hydrogens around it. This carbon would have 3 hydrogens. The second carbon would have 2. Now ethanol is used not only for your vehicles there, we also have drinking alcohol. It is made by the fermentation of grains, fruits, or starchy vegetables. So the type of alcohol that you have depends on where it came from. So let me get my glasses on so I can tell you the right information here. So if you start with barley, you end up with beer. And beer is about 4 to 6% alcohol. If you start with grapes, you end up with wine. Wine is about 12 to 14% alcohol. You go up a little bit higher here. How about potatoes? If you start with potatoes, you end up with vodka. And if you start with sugarcane, you end up with rum. Vodka and rum are about 40% alcohol. So when we start talking about the percent of alcohol, you may also hear about the proof. Proof is generally twice the percent. So if it is a 40% alcohol solution, it's an 80 proof. So that's where that term comes in. And when I was listing those off, notice that they had different percents. So you can drink a lot more beer than, say, rum and still receive the same amount of alcohol. So a standard drink has been designated as 14 grams of pure alcohol. So how much do you have to take to get that 14 grams of pure alcohol? And I've listed some different examples. That's about a can of beer. So a 12-ounce can of beer is one standard drink. Wine is 4 ounces, so it's a small glass of wine. Or if you are going to drink 80 proof liquor, that's your 40% alcohol. It's 1 fluid ounce, which is like 1 shot. So if you imagine I have a shot, a small wine glass, and then a 12-ounce beer, those all are standard drinks. They all have the same amount of alcohol in them. Now, alcohol works as a central nervous system depressant, so it's going to slow down the signaling between the brain and the rest of your body, so everything just kind of slows down just a little bit. And what we will often look at is what's called the blood alcohol concentration in the body. And so it's actually looking at the blood, but you're saying, wait a second, if you get pulled over and they check your blood alcohol, and it's called blood alcohol, they have you breathe into something. And when you breathe into something, it's not checking the blood, it's checking your lungs and the air coming out of it. It gets complex, but there's this relationship that's established between the blood and the alcohol evaporating into your body, so they can have some sort of relationship established. 0.08 is the blood alcohol concentration legal limit for most states for those of legal drinking age. If you are below legal drinking age, so if you're under 21, shouldn't be having any alcohol and driving. No, no, no. Now, how right or how wrong alcohol is, I'm not here to debate that portion. The blood alcohol concentration will depend on how many standard drinks that you've had, how long of a time it took for that, what is your body mass. Generally, for larger people, you have to drink more to have a similar effect. How much food have you had with that? There's a lot of different variables that go into the BAC. So just be careful. Don't drink and drive. Yeah. On the next slide, let's talk about some of the concerns, some of the issues that alcohol has. This is kind of an interesting slide because it talks about some of the risk and relates it back to your blood alcohol content. So if you get to just over 0.02, you're starting to feel pretty good. You're feeling a little more relaxed, lower inhibitions. Once you get to 0.08, remember that's the legal limit for driving in most places, or yeah, that's your limit. That's when you start to lose your coordination and your balance. And so you don't want to be driving when you're in this impaired state. If you keep going, you start having some slurred speech, some exaggerated emotions. Some people, one drink will do this to them, and a marked loss of motor skills. So you can't control yourself very well. At about 0.2, nausea, vomiting, and blackout occurs. 0.25, stupor, you have no idea what's going on. And then you start getting up to this life-threatening unconsciousness, about 0.3, leading up to 0.4, causing coma and even death. We unfortunately have actually had alcohol related deaths even here at CCC. Be careful. Be very careful. Now, alcohol is the second most widely consumed drug. The first most widely consumed drug is actually caffeine. We're all kind of guilty of that one, but alcohol is your second most widely consumed drug. Now, irresponsible consumption is a very large risk. Binge drinking is considered to be 4 drinks within a 2-hour period. And here's a fact that'll kind of blow your mind. 40% of college students admit to binge drinking within the last 2 weeks. Again, be very careful. There is a risk for addiction, and oftentimes that addiction is genetic. I know that due to family history, I probably have a higher than average risk of addiction. So I've always tried to consider that with my partying habits. Kind of weird to hear a teacher talk about that. We'll just say my non-partying habits. Pregnancy risk are a big issue. There have been many children that have born with developmental delays due to the mothers actually drinking while pregnant. Drunk driving, I don't think I should really have to tell you anything about that. You know, you've heard the horrors of drunk driving. And it's today we don't even necessarily talk about drunk driving. We have our distracted driving or drowsy driving or whatever else. If you're not in full control of yourself, you probably shouldn't be behind the wheel. Violence also tends to escalate because we have this idea that there's increased emotions when someone is drinking and lower inhibitions. You just can't control yourself quite as well. There is some side effects to drinking: flushed face, nausea, headache, and vomiting. A lot of these are due to metabolism by the liver. So as you drink, the liver tries to break down stuff. It tries to break down all the different compounds that you ingest into your body, and it happens through a series of redox reactions. Well, as the alcohols are being broken down, it increases the level of what are called aldehydes in your body. And those aldehydes are what cause a lot of those effects that you'll see. Now, alcohol isn't necessarily all bad. There are some benefits. You do have that relaxed feeling more or less. You just have to be very responsible. My husband, at one time, he was actually ordered to drink wine by his doctor. Wine, especially dark red wines, have been studied to help lower cardiovascular disease. So there are some positive benefits. Just again, please be careful. All right, so this one gets to be a little bit tricky, a little bit about marijuana or THC, tetrahydrocannabinol. These are from the dry leaves of the cannabis or the hemp plant. Um, this is one of the most commonly used illicit drugs in the U.S. And of course, right now, marijuana is being approved for medical use and or recreational use in different states. So, guys, y'all are in the history making portion here. Um, the view on marijuana has changed drastically over the past 10 years. 10 years ago, it was, completely considered to be a drug. Today, everyone's like, oh, but wait a second, it can have some positive effects. So it turns out just about any drug can have positive effects. It can also have negative effects. So let's talk about some of those different areas. Now, marijuana is considered to be lipophilic. That means that it's fat soluble. It takes a long time, days or weeks even, to completely clear the body. Your marijuana targets receptors in the brain associated with pleasure, thinking, and sensory perception. Generally, it is considered to be illegal. There are some states that have approved it for medical use to where you have to have a prescription more or less for it. There are some states where it can be used recreationally also. One of the problems with marijuana is that you get distorted perception, whether that be time, it interferes with short-term memory, it reduces your problem-solving skills and also your judgment. So we have been talking about drunk driving on the last couple of slides. Well, what happens if someone lights up some weed and then goes for a drive? Will that affect how they drive? And how are we going to be able to police that? Is there a limit to how much you can have? So these are all some of the questions that are going to have to come out and have to be discussed over the next few years. You do have some short-term physical responses to marijuana. You often see reddened eyes, dry mouth, and of course an increased appetite. These are considered to, marijuana is considered to have psychological dependence, not physical. So attempts at attempts at withdrawal will cause mood swings and irritability, but you don't necessarily see physical effects of that. There are medical benefits to marijuana. It helps reduce issues with glaucoma. It can help relieve nausea, especially related to cancer victims. They're looking at it for seizure victims to see how it can help out with those different areas. Again, how safe or how accepted a certain compound is Depends on the society at that point in time. It can impair brain development, and it also increases the risk of psychiatric disorders. Now, in the states where it's allowed, it is heavily taxed. So let me give you an example. The first month in Colorado, when it was allowed, Colorado raised $3.5 million in taxes from the sale of marijuana. In 1 month, Colorado received $3.5 million in taxes. Up to about 45% of the purchase price is actually taxes that you pay.